The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, established in 1948, is a landmark document that laid the foundation for fundamental human rights. It has inspired the adoption of over 70 human rights treaties and has been translated into more than 500 languages. Over 75 years later, this document remains the cornerstone of our understanding of human rights worldwide. The Declaration guarantees that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person, and that no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. Furthermore, it clearly states that no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. This is ultimately a social justice of the largest kind. It directly involves a marginalized group of children, those in child welfare systems who are the direct victims of child sex trafficking. The existence of child sex trafficking today is a blatant violation of all these rights and a disgrace to our modern society. This presentation will explore the disturbing connection between child sex trafficking and child welfare systems. Our hope is to alert you to an issue that demands our collective attention and action. Further, beyond just social work, the implications of the correlation between child sex trafficking and child public welfare systems make this an issue that must be addressed in a multitude of professions that work with and come in contact with children. This presentation is pertinent to teachers, law enforcement, counselors, coaches, parents, state and federal prosecutors, and volunteers working in youth settings. Ultimately, this is an issue that must be solved through the joint efforts of everyone who work with, guide, teach, coach, and protect children. Armed with this information, we trust that you will be compelled to advocate for the rights of all children, especially those in child welfare, and work towards ending this reprehensible practice. This presentation will examine the topic from multiple focal points, including incidence and prevalence data, the correlation between child sex trafficking and child welfare affiliation, adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and the increased risk of sex trafficking, legislation related to child sex trafficking and child welfare systems, gaps in protection within the United States, and recommendations for prevention. The presentation will delve into the connection between children in public child welfare systems and child sex trafficking, revealing how these children are intentionally targeted by traffickers. By exploring how adverse childhood experiences and subsequent trauma lead to involvement with child welfare systems, we aim to highlight that these children are not only more susceptible to becoming victims of trafficking, but are specifically targeted. Focusing primarily on data from the United States and affiliated areas, this presentation underscores that this issue is not confined to distant locations but is prevalent in our own country, state, and city. Our hope is to alert you to an urgent issue that demands our collective attention and action. With this information, we trust you will be compelled to advocate for the rights of all children, particularly those in child welfare, and work toward ending this egregious practice. First, let's establish a basic understanding of sex trafficking and how child sex trafficking is a distinct classification. Sex trafficking is a subcategory of human trafficking and involves the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act when a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. Child sex trafficking, however, does not require the element of force, fraud, or coercion for a child to be considered a victim. The child simply needs to be under the age of 18 and engage in a commercial sex act or receive anything of value. Child sex trafficking in the United States is known by various terms, including child, underage, or juvenile prostitution or sex work, survival sex, commercial sexual exploitation of children or CSEC, and domestic child sex trafficking or DCST. The terminology we use for child sex trafficking as practitioners matters. How the victims of child sex trafficking are referred to denotes how the children are perceived and treated by first responders, as well as how the children will identify themselves. Unfortunately, due to the terminology we use and how the issue has been perceived over time, many child victims do not identify as trafficked. Further, Many child victims will actually blame themselves for the acts they were forced to commit. For example, the use of the term child prostitute is an oxymoron as children cannot legally consent to sex. Thus, it is important to recognize that these children are victims of sex trafficking and should never be identified as child prostitutes or child sex workers. The United States Department of State reports that the total identified human trafficking victims have increased over 2 times, from 24,544 to 50,815 total victims in the Western Hemisphere from 2018 to 2024. This number becomes even more startling when one accounts for the fact that the total identified victims represent a mere fraction of the total affected population due to the surreptitious nature of human trafficking and underreporting of victims. The International Labor Organization estimates that there are a startling 1 million children around the world who are trafficked for the purpose of sex trafficking. The exact number of children and youth affected by human trafficking in the United States remains unknown and difficult to determine. This is because different sources provide varying numbers due to differences in definitions and methodologies. Collecting accurate data is challenging due to these inconsistencies. Survivors of trafficking may not self-identify due to complex trauma, trauma bonds, and the normalization of their victimization. The absence of effective screening mechanisms to identify victims leads to underreporting, as trafficking might be mistaken for child abuse or sexual abuse. A lack of services available after disclosure can also contribute to underreporting. Victims may not be identified if they speak with professionals who lack a trauma-informed approach, or if they fear authorities, distrust service providers, or have been coached by their traffickers on what to say. However, to give you a glimpse into the prevalence of sex trafficking in the United States, we will explore data through the lens of various organizations. This data represents just a snapshot of the total incidence of sex trafficking in the United States. It comes from the National Human Trafficking Hotline's most recent data, published in 2023. They received over 30,000 signals, or tips, of which 7,380 were from victims or survivors of human trafficking. There were over 9,600 identified cases of human trafficking, involving almost 17,000 victims in total. As evident, the majority of these cases involved sex trafficking. Of all the total cases reported through the National Human Trafficking Hotline, 38% involved child victims. The prevalence of child victims in sex trafficking is undeniable. The data highlight the significant involvement of youth in sex trafficking. This vulnerable population is actively targeted by traffickers to satisfy the paraphilia of their clientele, and due to the youth's inherent susceptibility, which makes them easy prey for victimization. Child sex trafficking is not a crime that occurs somewhere else that we can choose to neglect or ignore. It is happening right in our own country, state, and city. The United States ranked second in the world for sex trafficking, according to the U.S. Department of State in 2019. Furthermore, it is estimated that children make up around 40% of the sex trafficking population in the United States. Lastly, the average age of entry into child sex trafficking for youth in the U.S. is between 12 and 16 years old. These data points highlight the dire situation regarding child sex trafficking in the United States. As practitioners and citizens, we must be acutely aware of the presence of this criminal act and understand the vulnerability of our youth, which exposes them to this risk. In 2021, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received over 25,000 reports of missing or exploited children. Alarmingly, 1 in 6 of these children had experienced sex trafficking. This reported data alone highlights the significant issue of child sex trafficking in the United States. The situation becomes even more concerning when considering factors such as underreporting, lack of victim identification, missed screening opportunities, and a general lack of awareness. We will now examine the correlation between child welfare systems and child sex trafficking. There is an intersection at 2 distinct junctures. First, children who have been victims of sex trafficking are more likely to be removed from their environment and placed into child welfare systems. Second, youth who are placed into child welfare systems are at a heightened risk of recruitment for sex trafficking. The data provide evidence for a correlation between youth's involvement in child welfare systems and an increased likelihood that the youth has been a victim of sex trafficking. These data represent just a few of the harrowing statistics that link child trafficking, child sex trafficking, and child public welfare systems together. Back in 2013, when the NCMEC and the FBI jointly partnered to recover children in the sex industry in a massive 70-city operation, they found that 60% of the children who were rescued were presently in the foster care system. Also in 2013, New York found that 85% of total child trafficking victims in the state had child welfare involvement, and this correlation has been observed nationwide in various states, such as California, where this involvement was at 81%. In 2022, the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation conducted the Survey of Youth Transferring from Foster Care, SYTFC, to evaluate this correlation. They found that 79% of youth with trafficking allegations or self-reported trafficking allegations had such occurrences during child welfare placement. In 2016, the NCMEC reported that 86% of child trafficking victims were in foster care or social services. Further, 34% of youth reported that running away or being kicked out by a parent from their home preceded their first sex trafficking experience. Additionally, results from the STFC found that 40% of youth in child welfare had trafficking experiences occur prior to the age of 18, with the majority of those experiences involving sex trafficking. Despite limited research and reporting of this data, the available statistics and research all point to a strong correlation between youth who are victims of child sex trafficking and their involvement in child public welfare systems. There are three main takeaways integral to understanding the correlation between child welfare involvement and child sex trafficking. First, youth who are trafficking victims are more likely to be associated with the child welfare system. Second, when examining youth who are trafficking victims, there is a significant correlation specifically between child sex trafficking and child welfare placements. Third, youth who are trafficking victims are more likely to report that their first sexual encounter occurred before the age of 13, was unwanted, and involved someone who was 3 or more years older. Additionally, youth who are trafficking victims are more likely to report a history of sexual assault, abuse, and domestic violence than youth who were not. Therefore, it is essential to understand the vulnerability of children placed into child welfare systems. This vulnerability places them at a higher risk of being sex trafficked while in the child welfare system. Additionally, youth who have already been victims of sex trafficking are more likely to be placed and affiliated with child welfare systems. Thus, as practitioners, we must be acutely aware of this multifaceted vulnerability and actively work to protect, care for, and advocate for these children. There is a startling connection that exists between children who have undergone adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, children placed into child welfare systems, and the risk of being sex trafficked. As discussed earlier in the prevalence data, we highlighted that out of the 25,000 youth who were reported missing to the NCMEC, 1 in 6 of them had a sex trafficking history. This data point to the intersection of children who experience an ACE being targeted specifically by traffickers who are looking to exploit these vulnerable children, and the involvement of child welfare systems. With an increase of traumatic events that occur in a youth's life, there is an increase in the ACE score that the youth receives. To calculate an ACE score, the practitioner will add up the sum of the 3 main categories of ACE. 1, abuse, which include emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. 2, household challenges, which include mother treated violently, household substance abuse, mental illness in the household, parental separation or divorce, and criminal household member. And lastly, 3, neglect, which include emotional and physical neglect. Children who suffer ACEs also contain a marginalized group of children that are specifically susceptible to being sex trafficked, which include gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, Black or Hispanic youth, and youth with cognitive or physical disabilities. Therefore, there's a twofold correlation with adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, in which the child's exposure to ACEs causes them to be placed into child public welfare systems, and they are subsequently recruited for sex trafficking, or risk factors cause exposure to ACEs, which lead to participation in sex trafficking and ultimately then being referred to the child public welfare system. Either way, ACEs are a critical component in the interaction between the victimization of youth related to sex trafficking and their participation in child public welfare systems. This involvement of ACEs places a heavy and unique responsibility on child public welfare systems to identify, assist, and place into care youth who are sex trafficking victims, as well as simultaneously ensuring that enough protections are in place during their placement to protect the vulnerable youth from being preyed upon by sex traffickers. This presents a complex problem that has necessitated interventions and measures to be put into place to protect these vulnerable youth populations who are affiliated with the child public welfare system and are sex trafficking victims. Slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution back in 1865. However, human trafficking, to include sex trafficking, has been equated to and compared to modern-day slavery. Over the past 25 years, there have been numerous pieces of legislation that have been passed to adequately address human trafficking in the United States. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 established a framework to combat human trafficking through the 3 Ps: protection, prevention, and prosecution. It increased protections for victims, created immigration protections like the T and U visas, and mandated initiatives to prevent trafficking, including the creation of the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons and the Interagency Task Force to Monitor and Combat Trafficking. The Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2003 refined federal criminal provisions against trafficking, added human trafficking crimes as RICO predicates, and enabled trafficking victims to file civil lawsuits against traffickers in federal court. It also established the Senior Policy Operating Group to coordinate federal anti-trafficking policies and mandated an annual report from the Attorney General to Congress on efforts to implement the TVPA. The Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2005 provided extraterritorial jurisdiction over trafficking offenses committed by persons employed by or accompanying the federal government overseas. It established grant programs for states, Indian tribes, local governments, NGOs, and law enforcement agencies to support trafficking victims and combat trafficking, and directed the Department of Health and Human Services to implement a pilot program for juvenile trafficking victims. The Act also expanded the reporting requirements from the TVPRA 2003. The William Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008 introduced new measures to prevent and deter trafficking, including new crimes and penalties for obstructing investigations and prosecuting sex traffickers who recklessly disregard force, fraud, or coercion. It expanded T visa protections, required unaccompanied alien children to be screened for trafficking, and mandated information about workers' rights for visa applicants. The Act also increased penalties for trafficking-related crimes and imposed criminal liability on those who knowingly recruit workers with fraudulent representations. The TVPRA 2013 aimed to eliminate human trafficking from supply chains by establishing partnerships between the U.S. government and private entities. It strengthened minimum standards for combating trafficking, amended the RICO Act and Federal Criminal Code to address labor contract fraud and illicit sexual conduct, extended the statute of limitations for civil actions related to trafficking, and introduced new reporting requirements for the Attorney General's Human Trafficking Report. The JVTA 2015 enhanced tools to address human trafficking by facilitating the prosecution of customers of sex trafficking victims and adding advertising as a mode of offense. It clarified that proving the defendant's knowledge of the victim's age is unnecessary if there was a reasonable opportunity to observe the victim. The act directed forfeited assets to satisfy victim restitution orders, included child pornography in the definition of illicit sexual conduct, created a mandatory special assessment to fund victim services, and directed the Attorney General to maintain a national strategy to combat human trafficking. The TVPA 2017 provided additional funding and mandates to support trafficking victims and increase transparency in federal anti-trafficking efforts. It required the Attorney General to issue a human trafficking victim screening protocol, directed the DOJ to report on methodologies to assess trafficking prevalence, mandated the U.S. Advisory Council to review and report on federal policies, and allowed the AG to bring civil injunctions against trafficking-related acts. The Reauthorization Act of the same year encouraged increased efforts between the federal government and private entities, as well as added language for federal government to assess foreign government compliance. The act increased the federal focus on addressing forced labor by amending 18 U.S.C. 1375C to include labor trafficking prevention in diplomatic households, increasing reporting obligations on goods produced through forced labor, requiring the SPOG to establish a working group focused on demand reduction, and amending the Child Soldiers Prevention Act to include police or other security forces. As evidenced by 2.5 decades of legislation, trafficking in the United States has been on the radar of the federal government, its agencies, state agencies, child services, and law enforcement. We are now going to discuss ways in which the specific intersection of child sex trafficking and child public welfare is being addressed, as well as gaps that can be further bridged to ultimately bring an end to this practice. The McDonald et al. 2024 study assessed the effectiveness of the Start with the Youth, or STAR-Y program, aimed at supporting vulnerable youth in the child welfare system who are at risk of sexual exploitation. Results indicated successful implementation with minor challenges, highlighting key components such as a coordinated approach among child welfare personnel, ongoing risk monitoring, quality foster parent-youth relationships, and wraparound support services. The study found that while there was a notable decline in youth risk factors, the reduction in risk required more time than the initially proposed one-year timeline. The foster parent-youth relationship emerged as a crucial protective factor. Despite positive outcomes, the study acknowledged limitations, including the individualized nature of the model, a small sample size, and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Overall, the study emphasized the need for flexibility in specialized care models and ongoing evaluation to understand long-term risk reduction mechanisms. The McDonald et al. 2023 study explored sex trafficking prevention and support for youth in child welfare, highlighting the overrepresentation of this group among victims. It involved a systematic review of 19 programs and interviews with experts by experience. Findings emphasized the importance of trauma-informed services, wraparound support, and targeted prevention strategies. Challenges included miscommunications, limited funding, and the impact of social media. Despite implementation obstacles, the study underscored the need for specialized care models and ongoing evaluation to support at-risk youth effectively. Future recommendations of the study included further efforts to engage experts in the field and continued evaluation of prevention and intervention strategies that are specific to child welfare youth. Child welfare agencies are uniquely positioned to identify, recover, and assist victims of human trafficking, particularly youth in foster care or residential treatment centers, who are at higher risk. However, change must occur at this level to provide better protection. T. Ortiz, a sex trafficking survivor and policy advocate, stated that many kids across the country still go under the radar due to screening models across states that lack uniformity, consistency. Ortiz believes that for this to change and to close the gap, federal government and state officials must provide the impetus for change and ensure that it happens. Further, when youth are ready to accept help, services like therapy and evidence-based treatment developed by survivors should be readily available for them. For example, evidence-based curriculum such as My Life, My Choice and the Survivor's Guide to Leaving are resources that have been specifically created for at-risk youth and were created by survivors who have been in their place. Additionally, further evidence-based strategies need to be researched, evaluated, developed, and implemented to bridge the gap and provide mechanisms to prevent victimization. This can only be created through collaborative efforts between child welfare groups, interorganizational, and other interprofessional groups that can gather and share resources to create systems of aid to those in need. This means that law enforcement, teachers, counselors, coaches, and volunteers in youth settings must work collaboratively to solve this issue. This will require all those who work with children to work outside of their traditional silos that they work in currently and actively connect with other professionals to create evidence-based solutions. Accurate data collection on trafficked children and youth is critical for several reasons. First, it allows policymakers and advocates to understand the true extent of the issue, making it possible to request and allocate adequate funding for necessary services. Second, it helps identify trends and patterns in trafficking, such as demographic factors, geographic hotspots, and common methods used by traffickers. The federal government, law enforcement, including federal, state, and municipal, reporting agencies, child welfare agencies, etc., all need to work together to establish standardized protocols for data collection and reporting to ensure consistency and reliability across different regions and organizations. More research is essential to understanding the intersectional issues that place certain groups of children and youth at a higher risk of trafficking. This includes examining factors such as ACEs, socioeconomic status, family dynamics, and community environments. By identifying these factors, researchers can develop evidence-based practice approaches to minimize risk and provide targeted support to those most vulnerable. Ongoing collaboration between researchers, practitioners, and survivor leaders is crucial in developing comprehensive and sustainable solutions. This collaboration will lead to evidence-based practices that should be continuously evaluated and updated based on new research findings and feedback from those directly involved in anti-trafficking efforts. We must all actively work diligently and collaboratively to harness our unique strengths and talents to create a system that prevents victimization through early identification, early intervention, and adequate treatment. Until then, this problem will continue to create more victims every day. These are just 3 of the countless survivor victims who have been rescued from sex trafficking. Their stories are shared to provide insight into their perspectives while being trafficked. Hazel, like many trafficked youth, was so hardened by a life of struggle and strife that she didn't even realize she was a victim. It's crucial to remember that sex trafficking victims, especially youth, may not fully understand how they have been victimized. James, similar to Hazel, also struggled to recognize that what he was experiencing was sex trafficking. He held a different narrative in his mind than what was actually happening. Practitioners must be acutely aware of the signs of trafficking and help educate their clients. Lastly, Ursel shares her perspective on finding the motivation to escape trafficking and seek help, which came with the birth of her son. It's vital to remember that sex trafficking victims, especially youth, are survivors who have been hardened through years of abuse and torture. Identifying symptoms, being empathetic, offering unconditional support, and advocating for them is essential to help save them. At 15 years of age, Jose's harrowing story of victimization began when he ran away to escape his home. However, prior to leaving home, he experienced mental, physical, and emotional abuse from family and peers due to his sexuality. Despite experiencing numerous incidences that would qualify as ACEs, the lack of support and intervention from law enforcement and child protective services caused Jose to be victimized. Jose said that he is trying to spread awareness because there were so many points in this story where things could have turned out differently if the systems that are supposed to protect vulnerable people, children in particular, had worked. Child Protective Services had been to my family home a number of times because of the abuse, but nothing was done. Jose goes on to state, The most important part to saving victims is realizing how many different ways we could have done something before. As anything as horrific as to what happened to me happens to me, someone else. Jose's individual testimony is representative of a social justice issue that exists within this social issue, that youth who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender are at a higher risk of being victimized. These marginalized youth are targeted specifically due to issues that they may be experiencing in their lives surrounding their sexual identity. Ortiz T. Walker Pettigrew, a sex trafficking survivor and survivor advocate, said, "Foster care was the perfect training ground for a life of trafficking because it was in foster care throughout my 14 plus different placements where I first internalized the duality of being cared for and being raped. It was in foster care where I realized I was tied to a paycheck." This chilling statement serves as a perfect understanding of the nexus between child sex trafficking and child public welfare systems. Although child welfare systems are well positioned to contact, identify, and protect child trafficking victims, they are also extremely overburdened, underfunded, and inadequately staffed. This presentation and body of research is merely a launching point for the work that must be done to fully understand this relationship and create solutions to address the correlation as well as the increased vulnerability of children to be victimized who are in or have been affiliated with the child welfare system. However, this is a problem that must not only be studied but must be solved. The guiding ethical principles of social workers compel them to help people in need and to address social problems, challenge social injustice, and to respect the inherent dignity and worth of the person. Therefore, it is every social worker's responsibility, whether in the micro, meso, or macro, to confront this injustice and bring it to an end. Even outside of the realm of social work, law enforcement, teachers, counselors, coaches, parents, and volunteers in youth settings must confront this issue collaboratively. Through our joint efforts, we all can impact children who have been affected or are susceptible to child sex trafficking. Thank you for your time and attention.